This episode of Ridiculous 40K Rules is brought to you by the Magnet Baron. More about them later on. What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and you're probably misplaying the first thing you do in basically every game of Warhammer 40K that you play. The command phase, the first step of each of your turns, is, as befits an entry on this series, ridiculously complicated. It's vitally important for scoring and many army abilities. What we're going to be doing today is breaking down each step of the command phase, the proper sequencing of those steps, and what is supposed to occur within each. First, it's important to remember that while the command phase is the first thing that you do during your turn, it's not necessarily the same as effects that occur at the start of your turn, meaning that some things will have to be sequenced before your command phase begins. Once your turn begins and you complete all of that start of turn stuff, you then move to the command phase, which is broken down into 4 distinct sub-phases. Now, the game calls these steps, but there is both a start and end step that, while is mechanically important, isn't actually called a step in the core rulebook, but that's what how I'll be referring to them over the course of this video. So we start appropriately at the start of command phase step. This is when several things happen, including drawing tactical secondaries. If you are playing Pariah Nexus or Chapter Approved 2025 and you're using a tactical secondary deck, you draw those cards now. That's important because you're meant to know what secondaries you have available for you before you start to select command phase abilities and before you move to battle shocking your units. Speaking of battle shock, the other thing that occurs here is that units unbattle shock, unless for whatever reason their battle shock is described as being persistent. It's very rare, but a couple of abilities in 40k do say that they battle shock a unit until a particular time, in which case that will override this timing. However, any other instance of battle shock disappears at this point, meaning that all units are definitionally unbattle shocked for their own command step, and that may recheck later on during the phase. This video is brought to you by the Magnet Baron. Magnet Baron is your one-stop shop for all of your miniature magnetization needs. If you are looking to get into some of the new big stompy factions that have just released, Magnet Baron wants me to talk to you about their new no-drill magnet kits. These are kits that apply alongside large miniatures like Imperial Knights and give you replacement parts as well as magnets that allow you to utilize the entire kit, adding specialized attachments and joints that allow you to add magnets into the construction of the model, allowing you to easily swap your weapons on and off. With how fast the metagame of 10th edition Warhammer 40k changes, having flexible weapon options on your models just makes sense, and especially for these expensive vehicle and Titan kits that have a wide variety of options available to them, magnets are the way to go. So check them out at themagnetbaron.com. Links are in the video description. Big thanks to Magnet Baron for sponsoring this video. Now let's get back to it. Now, it's appropriate we talk about the command step because that's the next step of the phase. And this one is a little confusingly named because it sounds like it is a catch-all term for all command phase things, and that's kind of the case. However, this step is the main body of the command phase, and unless otherwise specified, literally every single command phase ability must be resolved here. While there are some stratagems and things that will occur at the start of the phase or during the battle shock step, for example, if your ability or your rule doesn't say that, it always happens during this command step segment. People get this wrong all the time, and it's important to note that things that don't have a specified timing within the command phase can't be sequenced as you see fit. They must occur at some point during this command step. Now, this is crucially important for the correct resolution of many army abilities. Things like the Tyrannid's Shadow in the Warp and Astra Militarum orders from Voice of Command are perfect examples. Both of these abilities must be resolved before moving on to the battle shock step of your command phase, meaning that while you can operate with the knowledge of what objective cards you have drawn for that turn, given that you have drawn them at the start of the phase, you do not get to know which of your units become battle shocked when you are deciding to resolve these abilities. A Tyrannid player doesn't know if you would have battle shocked naturally before deciding to use their Shadow in the Warp, and an Astra Militarum player does not know whether or not their your crucial units are battle shocked naturally before trying to issue orders to them. I see a lot of players determining battle shocks before assigning the effects in this step, and that is incorrect, and in some cases can be very meaningfully changing to the game. Now, within this step, sequencing is a little bit more nebulous, so it's usually up to either the active player's discretion or a conversation between you and your opponent at which order things will resolve. In some cases, because you can choose to use things at any time during the command step, it's beneficial to declare their use at the beginning or end of that step, before or after your opponent has made certain decisions. Now, after that step is complete, we move on to the battle shock step of the turn. This is the step at which units that are below half of their starting strength, meaning they've lost more than half of their wounds in the case of a single entity unit, such as a character or a vehicle, or half of their models in the case of a multiple model unit. If you have lost more than half of those, you are below half strength and are eligible to test for battle shock during this step. It's important to know that this is below half strength, not at half strength. So units that are, for example, at 5 models out of a starting strength of 10 are at half strength. They would have to lose 1 additional model in order to be forced to test in this battle shock step. Now, you'll go through the step and test individually for each unit, and during the resolution of this, you can choose to use the Insane Bravery stratagem. That allows you to spend 1 CP before rolling for a unit to automatically pass them. Now, it's important to note, this is the only time that Insane Bravery can be used. Because it is timed specifically to your battle shock step, no other instance of battle shock can be affected by Insane Bravery. So even if you have some sort of battle shock earlier in the command phase, for example, Shadow in the Warp coming back again, you cannot use Insane Bravery on that test. In addition, that on the battlefield requirement for units taking battle shock tests is important, since units inside transports or in reserve at this stage are not required to battle shock, even if they are below half strength. It's only the units standing on the table. Instead, repositioned units, which are units that are picked up from the battlefield and then returned to the battlefield through some mechanism, usually by jumping in and out of reserves. If such units are below half strength, they must test when they arrive back on the battlefield. That means that these repositioned units, if they're testing outside the battle shock step, cannot use Insane Bravery, meaning that you have no control over whether or not that unit returns to the table battle shocked or not, and you don't even know if they are battle shocked when deciding to set them back up. The same is not, for whatever reason, true of transports, however. Transports are explicitly excluded from all of the repositioned unit rules, so if you are below half strength in a transport, you are simply immune to battle shock. You don't have to take it in the battle shock step because you are in a transport, not on the battlefield, and you don't have to take it when disembarking because you've already passed the battle shock step when it comes to the movement phase, in which case you would disembark normally. It's also important to note that, generally speaking, units are never required to take more than 1 battle shock test in this step. There exist many abilities that will force battle shock checks during the battle shock step for some criteria, usually being below starting strength. Such effects are determined by the rules commentary to simply modify the requirements to take a battle shock test, not actually impose new requirements, meaning that if you've already tested because you're below half strength, you won't have to retest again. Note that this is not the case for battle shock tests taken at any other time. So, for example, if your opponent is affecting you with multiple things that could force you to take battle shock checks in the command step of the command phase, those can all stack. However, if they do have some similar abilities that all occur during the battle shock step, generally speaking, those will not. Once all of your units have determined whether or not they are battle shocked, we move to the end of the command phase. This is the timing at which you can use the new orders stratagem. This is included in most mission formats if you're using tactical objectives to discard and redraw a tactical mission card from your hand. This means that the decision to use this stratagem can wait until you've seen the effects of your battle shock. However, you cannot use it earlier in the phase to determine what abilities you need to target where. For example, if I needed to use an ability to speed up a unit or repair it or add models back to that unit in order to score a secondary, and that secondary would have come from the new order stratagem, I wouldn't know whether or not I have it in my hand during the command step at the time in which I would normally use those abilities. Also at this time is when you will recalculate your level of control over objectives, adding the objective control characteristic of all of your models within 3 inches of that objective marker and determining whether or not you or your opponent controls it, or it's contested. This always occurs at the end of each phase, so a unit being battle shocked will not contribute their objective control characteristic, assuming that it returns to 0 because of the battle shock effect, meaning that if you only have battle shocked units trying to take an objective, more often than not, you'll lose control of that objective, and you won't subsequently score it for primary objective scoring. This is why it's important that the level of control check occurs at the end of the phase after the battle shock step is complete, because it can affect your primary objective scoring. Now, after all of that level of control calculation is done, then your missions will check whether or not you score based on those objectives. This is because of the rules commentary, which forces primary and secondary objective scoring effects to sequence after all other effects within the game. So you must have resolved all other end of command phase effects before moving on and checking to see whether or not you'll get any victory points for holding down those objectives. So as you can see, the minutia of timing within the command phase is not only very complicated, but also vitally important for the proper resolution of a ton of abilities in the game, as well as the completion of objectives.
I'm recording this while editing on my laptop, but I made a cheat sheet for all of the things I talked about in this video. It's right here on the screen so that you can keep the whole phase separate for yourself.
Let me know down in the comment section if any of this made sense to you and if you like this system. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks to everybody who supports Tactical Tortoise, whether or not that's over on Patreon at patreon.com/tacticaltortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All of you are amazing. And big thanks to Magnet Baron for sponsoring this video. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.